In this video, I'm going to show you how to put together a $750 gaming PC that you can actually buy the parts for in 2021. I'm going to run you through all of the component choices and detail how much we paid for each part. I'm going to put the system together from start right through to finish before booting it up to see how good it looks, but also how well it performs in the biggest and most popular titles out there. Everything from Apex Legends, Overwatch, Call of Duty Warzone, Cyberpunk and more, we've got it covered. Let's dive into it though, after a quick ad from today's video sponsor. The Corsair K70 RGB 10 keyless Champion Series keyboard is one of Corsair's latest releases and builds a keyboard in an awesome 10 keyless form factor. The Champion range has been specifically developed with top esports pros and builds on years of testing. RGB can be easily customized in Corsair iQ as usual, while durable PBT double shot keycaps and Cherry MX switches guaranteed for 100 million keystrokes keep you on top of your game. Learn more at the link in the description below. Let's kick things off by talking through each of our component choices first, before putting the system together. Now this is actually going to be an Intel powered system. That's because the new i5-11400F is one of the most remarkable value CPUs I've ever got my hands on. When coupled with a good B560 motherboard, like this B560M DS3H, you've got quite an incredible combo on your hands with 6 cores and 12 threads, some really good base and boost clock speeds out of the box as well. It really is a fantastic chip that's going to be great not only for the GPU choice in this build, but future upgrades to say a 3060 or 3060 Ti later on down the line. B560 boards really do give you all of the features you could want, from Gen 4 NVMe SSD support to a built-in IO shield on some of the higher end models. With it being Intel, it's not quite so fussed when it comes to the memory choice. Nevertheless, I've got a 16GB kit of XPG's Gamix D20. This kit is going to work really well, once again pave the way for future upgrades, and 8GB of RAM unfortunately just isn't enough anymore. If you're putting together say a GT 1030 system like we did recently, then 8GB is acceptable, but otherwise it's go 16 or go home in my opinion. Because of course we've gone for an Intel chip, we do need to pick up an aftermarket cooler, which does introduce a little bit of extra cost, but even then the 11400F is still way cheaper than a last generation Ryzen 5 3600X. The Cooler Master Hyper 212 RGB Black Edition does that really nicely. A large blacked out heatsink, 120mm RGB fan, and a price point that just cannot be beaten makes it a phenomenal choice. Storage is handled by a Seagate Barracuda Q1. You can read our full written review of this drive in the card section here. This is a fantastic 2.5-inch SSD, and while it's not as quick as the latest NVMe options out there, for a budget build like this, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. And of course, it's still an SSD, it's not a hard drive, so you're still going to get some pretty good read and write speeds comparatively. Power for the system is provided by a Cooler Master MWE500. This is the most basic power supply that I would probably pick up for any system, but being from Cooler Master, it's pretty efficient, pretty reliable, and you're backed by some good warranties. If you're going to upgrade later to a 3060, 3060 Ti, or new Radeon 6600 or whatever they end up calling it, you will need to swap this out, but for now it's $50 well spent. The system is going to be built inside Cooler Master's MB320L, my favourite budget case ever. I keep coming back to this and back to it again, and for good reason. If you'd like to learn more about it, we featured it in our top 5 cases for 2021. It's awesome and one of the best chassis Cooler Master makes. I think it makes sense to put together as much of the system as possible, explaining the hurdles to you guys as we go along, before jumping into the graphics card choice a little bit later, and showing how you guys at home can pick one up right now for a reasonable price. Sit tight. When it comes to installing the cooler, it's a bit more complicated than a stock cooler, but actually fairly easy once you get the hang of it. You want to take the backplate assembly with these 4 screws poking through, and then pop these through the holes around the CPU. It's probably easier actually to show you by spinning the motherboard around, and then just drop in the backplate into place. You can then lay it back on the motherboard box before using these female to female screws to secure the backplate into place. Once you've done this, the CPU cooler then really easily screws on top and make sure to leave the fan off, as we'll add this in a little bit later. It will make screwing the motherboard in that little bit easier. So the motherboard assembly, as it's called, is now complete. That's basically where you install as many parts onto the motherboard as possible. Make sure to install as well the metal I/O shield at the rear of the case. This has all of the cutouts you'll need for all of the ports are actually situated on the rear I/O of the motherboard. Some higher end boards have this built in, but with this being a more value oriented option, it does not. Once you've done this, you can then go ahead and simply pop the motherboard assembly into the case and you're good to go. Looking good. So the motherboard is into the case and it brings us on to the next component. It is of course the SSD. I talked more about this Barracuda earlier on in the video, but I wanted to show you the really cool installation method. So you can see we've got these 4 little posts that come included with the case. They screw into the drive and then the drive simply pops through the 4 holes on the top of the power supply shield. We will give this SATA data and SATA power later, but I do love how you can see it through the side panel. It's on view on display and looks pretty good. That brings us nicely on then to the graphics card, the component a lot of you will have been waiting to hear about. Now, believe it or not, GPU prices are actually falling. We made a video on this, which you can check out in the card section now, and the 1650 is one of those cards. Availability, brand new, is still pretty tricky, but there are some good used options on eBay, and if you look through the completed listings, you'll actually find prices are a lot lower than they were 8, 9 or 10 weeks ago. The 1650 as well is a great stopgap card. It's a great GPU to pick up and tie you over until the 30 series are back into mainstream stock. And the reason for that is as follows. If you buy a 3060 now at scalped prices, you'll be paying around about $800 and you're never going to get any of that money back. Pick up something like this for $200, maybe $250 at a stretch, and although it's $80 or so over what it should be, you're not losing a great deal of money. This card is also fantastic at 1080p as well. 1080p medium settings, you'll be surprised the FPS numbers you're able to achieve, though we will cover these off in the gaming benchmarks very shortly. This Zotac card with 1 fan is awesome, but basically any 1650 or even 1650 Super you can find at a reasonable price point is what I'd opt for. You've got no power connector to plug in either, so it's a simple case of sliding the GPU into the case, and that's pretty much it. And once you've done this, we've basically got one more component left to install, and that is of course the power supply. We covered this off a little bit earlier, but one thing I forgot to mention is how nice the cables are. They're not sleeved or braided or anything like that, of course, but they're also not this horrible multicolored affair. They're black, they're sleek, and they'll fit awesomely. Awesomely? Is that a word? I don't know. We're just going to roll with it. They'll fit awesomely in our Cooler Master MB320 OWL. Let's go ahead though and get everything powered up and turn the system on to see how good it looks with all that RGB and all of our fans spinning, before finally taking a look at the performance and seeing just how much bang for your buck the 1650 is really able to deliver. I'll see you in a second, but first, roll that montage. When it comes to the performance of a system like this one, I think you're all going to be really pleasantly surprised with just how powerful the 1650 Super actually is. Yes, this build is great for a future GPU upgrade, but it's also really good for the present day. We've tested out a load of the latest and most popular games out there, and we'll put a summary of all the different numbers we were able to achieve on your screen now. Let's take a closer look though at some of these titles today, see how good the games look visually and check out some of the frame rates. Now the first of those focus titles is GTA 5. Here we got an impressive 82 frames per second on average, with 1080p medium to high settings across the board in all the titles today. This was tested in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode, meaning you guys can repeat these results on your own systems at home to see what kind of improvement a build like this would give you. Apex Legends is a similarly positive story. At 1080p, we got just shy of 76 FPS on average, which is actually not too bad, and the 90 and 99th percentile results, which measure just how low the frame rate drops, bottomed out at 62, meaning we stayed above 60 frames a second pretty much the entire time in Apex, which is obviously really important. Watch Dogs Legion is next up. Here we got 55 frames per second on average, tested in the game's inbuilt benchmarking mode. Not bad when you consider the 1650 is a couple of years old, and Watch Dogs is one of the most demanding AAA titles out right now. Call of Duty's Black Ops Cold War gave us some pretty similar but slightly better numbers. 61 FPS on average to be precise. This is of course the multiplayer zombies mode, which we test out as it's the most popular game mode in Cold War. We'll move on to Warzone a little bit later. Before that though, Valorant. Here we got 210 FPS at 1080p, pretty high settings actually in Valorant. One of the easiest games to run, but still incredibly popular. And a system like this is going to be awesome for those esports kind of games. Next up today then is a little bit of Cyberpunk. Yes, that's right, we tested Cyberpunk 2077, the most difficult game to run ever on this PC. We achieved just over 40 FPS, so perhaps sit out Cyberpunk at least at 1080p, though it is worth noting there's no CPU bottleneck here, so if you did bump the GPU up to something like a 3060, you could easily achieve 70 or 80 FPS in Cyberpunk once GPU stock returns back to normal. Thankfully, Fortnite, which is the next game today, gave us some slightly better results. At 1080p competitive settings, which is where you tune everything down to low, set the render distance to far to maximise your frame rate, and you do this on even high-end builds, we got 142 FPS on average, with 130 and 112 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results. Not bad going. Overwatch then is the next game and the penultimate title today. Here we got 120 frames per second. That's right, over 120 FPS on average, tested as ever with MSI Afterburner's Reaver Tuner and of course NVIDIA FrameView. Call of Duty's Warzone is next up then and the final title today. Here we got 69 frames per second on average, don't mind if I do, with 62 and 57 for the 90 and the 99th percentile results, giving us some very playable frame rates in some of the biggest titles out there. And on that note, that pretty much wraps it up for the entirety of today's video. Thank you for tuning in, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.